Bava Metzia. And tomorrow, Shas Thomas, we're finishing Bava Metzia. Mercy Hashem. Today's shiur daily nation was Aaron Nachman Simcha Kohen Yoshua Marcham Shtep Sabracha Slavish Malay Beyond Mesh B'Niyos the Minute Shtep Slav Aliyah. Every first time if you saw Merach Aliyah Rachel as Pasal Zelda Rachel Yana Basia Bracha. I'm Yisra Berisha Chabas the Labir Fush the Ever Shachal Yisrael. And a shout out to our good friends at the Imperial Advisory Group. If you need help with your CFO stuff, please reach out to them at imperialgrp.com. We're going to talk about today about the halachas regarding renting a farm, renting a field to use for farming. You have that's going to be today's shiur. So Perek Tes Mishnah Aleph. Hamekabel Sada Mechaveru. Someone rents a field from his friend, and they do not specify how the crops are to be harvested. Ma'akav Shenagul Liksor Yiksor. If they are in a place where the farmers are accustomed to harvest the crops by cutting them, then he must cut them. Lak or Yakor, where they are accustomed to harvesting the crops by uprooting them, then he must uproot them. Um, Typically, grains can be harvested in either by being cut or by uprooted from the ground. There are advantages and disadvantages. There are advantages and disadvantages to each method. And if that was discussed beforehand, then great. If not, then you have to go by the minhag of the makom. Lachrosh achrav yachrosh. Similarly, in a place where it's customary to plow the field after the harvest in order to destroy the weeds, the renter must plow the field. The kakol kemega medina. In general, everything that was not specified between the renter and the owner must be done according to local custom. Just as they just as they share the grain, so too they share the straw and the stubble. Similarly, if a sharecropper rents a vineyard, just as he and the owner share the wine produced by the vineyard's grapes, so they also share the branches that are trimmed from the grapevines. And at the end of the season, they share the poles that supported the vines as they grew. They share these poles because they both provide poles. They both share the cost of setting up the poles at the beginning of the season. Therefore, they share the poles after the grapes are harvested. Mishnah Beis. Hamakabel Sadi B'Chaver, someone who rents a field from his friend, he Beis Hashalchim, and it's a field that requires to be irrigated. The crops cannot grow without rainwater alone. It must be watered by other means. Yet the field contains a spring from which it can easily be watered. Or Beis or he rents a field that contains a fruit tree, which provides him with fruit in addition to the field's crops. Yavash Hamayan. If the spring dries up, and Nick Sasa Elon, or if the fruit tree is cut down, Eno Menake Lo Min Chachura. The renter may not deduct anything from the rent, even though he lost the advantage of the spring or tree. However, if the renter had originally said to the owner, rent me this field that requires irrigation, or rent me this field that contains a tree, if the spring dried up or the tree was cut down, he can deduct from the rent by specifying the field's qualities. When he rented it, he made it clear that he agreed to the price only because the field had an extra advantage. Accordingly, if it loses that advantage, he can deduct from the rent. Mishnah Gimel, Hamekabel said the Havira. Someone rents a field from his friend as a sharecropper who leaves it fallow. He doesn't plant it or plow it. Shaman also common royal. We evaluate the field to see how much it could have produced if it was planted. And noticing though, and the sharecropper must give the owner what he would have received as a share if crops had been planted. Shekach kosilo. This is because a sharecropper writes the following to the owner in the rental document: Im ovir v'lo avid. If I leave the field fallow and do not work it, shalem b'meitzvah. I will pay you based on what the field will produce if it were planted properly. Mishnah Dalet. Hamakabel sadem echaveru. Someone rented a field from his friend for a fixed payment. Below Nakish. They did not want to weed the field, and as a result, the field would produce fewer crops. And he said to the owner, Ma why does it matter to you whether I weed the field? Since I give you a set payment for the field, no matter how much it produces, the weeds will not affect the amount you receive. Ain't Shaman low. We do not listen to him, and we must weed the field. Because the owner could say to him, um, that although the weeds may not affect me now, but tomorrow when your rental is over, you will leave the field, and it will and if you do not weed it now, it will grow weeds for me then and affect my crops. Therefore, it's a problem. Mishnah Hey. I'm a Kabbalah Southern Mechavero. Someone rents a field from his friend, he's a sharecropper. Low us a sub, but did not produce a significant amount. He does not think it's worth his time to tend the few crops that are growing. The owners, however, want the sharecropper to tend to whatever crops are there. The lacha is that if there's enough produce growing in the field that when harvested will form a pile of grain, the sharecropper must continue to take care of the field. If the field cannot produce that amount, he may abandon the crops. Rabbi Yehuda said, Ma kitzvah b'kri. Why should there be a fixed limit of a pile of grain for every field? It should depend on the size of the field. A large farm requires more work than a small field, and a large field requires more work than a small field, and should need to produce more grain to be worth the effort. Rather, the sharecropper must continue to tend the crops only if there's enough produce growing in the field to yield as much grain as was originally used to plant the field. Mishnah Vav Hamakabel Sadeh Mechaveru. Someone rents a field from his friend for a fixed payment to Achla Chagav O Nishtafa, and his crops are eaten by locusts or ruined by strong winds. And so the lacha is Yimakas Medina. If it's a regional disaster that the locusts or strong winds will ruin most of the fields in the area, you can deduct from his rent. The fact that most local fields were affected indicates this calamity was the result of every degree or on the whole area, and therefore the owner and the renter must share in the loss. If Eina Makas Medina, but if it's not a regional disaster, meaning that most of the fields in the area were not affected, the renter cannot deduct it from his rent. In this case, the owner can argue that since only the renter's crops were damaged, it must be due to the renter's bad fortune, and he must absorb the loss himself. Rabbi Yehuda says, in Kibla, if he rented the field from the owner for money and not for payment of produce, in either case, he cannot deduct from his rent, even if the disaster was a result of a heavenly decree on the whole area. The fact that only produce was destroyed indicates that the decree was against produce and not against money. Since the owner is not paid in produce, he was not included in the decree and that should not lose out because of the disaster. Mishnah Zion of Kabel said the Mechaverba Seres Korchita Lushana. Someone rents a wheat field from his friends for a fixed payment of 10 quarters of wheat a year. Lock stuff, even if the field is damaged, and as a result, its crop was of poor quality. No say lo mitocha. He pays the owner with 10 cores of wheat from that field. He doesn't have to buy wheat of better quality in order to pay the rent. Hayu chita yafos. If the field's wheat was of especially good quality, you cannot say to the owner, I will buy ordinary wheat from the market to give you, and I will keep all the high quality wheat for myself. And they know saying lo mitocha, rather he must give the owner 10 cores of the wheat that grew in that field. Mishnah Ches. Hamikabel said the Mechavel is Arusor. If someone rents a field from his friend for a fixed payment and agrees to plant it with barley, lo Yisrael Chitim, he may not plant it with wheat because wheat weakens the land more than barley does. Chitim is Enasorim. However, if he agreed to plant wheat, he may plant it with barley because that will place less strain on the land. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Oser, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel forbids making any change. Because switching crops from year to year weakens the soil, and therefore any change can weaken the land. If a renter agreed to plant grain in the rented field, he may not plant it with beans, because beans weaken the land more than grain does. However, if he agreed to plant beans, he may plant it with grain, since that will place less strain on the land. Rav Shimon Gamliel forbids making any change because any change can weaken the land. Mishnah Tes. Hamikabel Sadeh V'Chavil is Shanim Mu'etes. If someone rents a field from his friend for a few years, less than 7 years, Lo Yisrael Pishtan, he may not plant it with flax. This flax weakens the land and it does not return to full strength for 7 years. Since he rented the field for less than 7 years, he'll return it in a weaker state than he received it. Likewise, he does not have the right to cut the beams of wood for a sycamore tree in the field, because the sycamore tree takes 7 years to grow back fully, and if he cuts its branches, he will not return it in the same state as he received it. If he rented the field from him for 7 years, then the first year of the rental, he may plant it with flax. And he has the right to cut the beams from a sycamore tree. By the time the rental period is over, the field or tree would have returned to its original state. Mishnah Yud. We're going to talk about Shemitah for a little bit. If someone rents a field from his friend saying, I'm renting this field for 1 7-year period for the price of 700 Jews, Hashvias min minion, and the Shemitah year is counted as part of the 7 years. Since he specified 1 7-year period, he keeps the field for 7 years in a row, even though he will not be able to work the land during one of those years. However, if you rented it from saying, I will do the field for 7 years, 700 Jews, and a minion, then the Shemitah is not counted as part of the 7 years. In this case, the renter implied that he was renting the field for 7 years during which it can be used. Therefore, he keeps the field for 7 years aside for the Shemitah, which is at 8 years in total. New topic. Mr. Yiralef. Shiur Yom Gova Kalayla. Someone who's hired to work the entire day and finishes at sunset, collects his wages during the entire night. That follows. So the night is the proper time for him to be paid. If the employer is not paid before dawn, the employer transgresses the Torah's command to pay a worker on time. Someone who's hired to work for the entire night and finishes at dawn, collects his wages during the entire day that follows. That day is the proper time for him to be paid. If the employer does not pay him before sunset, the employer transgresses the Issa. Shiur Shaus, someone who's hired for only a few hours must be paid based on when he finishes working. Gova Kol Halayla, if he finishes during the night, he collects his wages the entire night. He must be paid before dawn. The Kol Hayom, and if he finishes work during the day, he collects his wages the entire day. He must be paid before sunset. Shir Shabbos, Shir Chodesh, Shir Shana, Shir Shavua. In the case of someone who hired to work for a week, or work for a month, or work for a year, or work for a 7 year period, the halach is Yatzva Yom Kol Yom. If he finished his work during the day, he collects his wages anytime during the day. He must be paid before sunset. Yatzva Laila Laila Kol Yom. If he finished his work at night, he collects his wages anytime during the entire night and the entire next day. He must be paid before the next sunset. Mishnah Yud Beis Echad Schar Adam. Whether someone owns a person's wages, Echad Schar Behema, or payment for renting an animal, Echad Schar Kelim, or payment for renting utensils. Yesh Ba Mishum Yamatitin Scharo. He's chayiv to the requirement to pay time based on the wages on that day. Yesh ba mishum lo salim v'lasachir itcha aboker. And based on the pasuk, you may not keep the wages of a worker with you overnight until morning. AMSI, when does a person violate this isser against paying a worker late? Zman shetiva. When the worker asked him for his wages and the employer did not pay within the proper time. Lo sivo, over a lot. But if the worker did not ask him for his wages, the employer does not transgress the isser if he does not pay on time, because we can assume that the worker agrees not to be paid right away. Similarly, if the employer directed the worker to a storekeeper, that he arranged for a storekeeper to give the worker food equal to the value of his wages, or he directed the worker to a money changer, and he arranged the money changer to pay the worker. Over allowed. The employer does not transgress the isser if the storekeeper or money changer does not pay the worker for the end of that day or night. Schir b'zmano. If a worker asks for his payment during the time he's supposed to be paid, and the employer claims that he had already paid him, nishma v'notel, and the worker can swear that he had not been paid and collect the money from the employer. The worker is believed and not the employer, because we suspect that the employer is preoccupied with his business and somebody thinks he paid the worker, but actually did not do so. However, once the proper time, the worker has been paid, has passed, the worker claims that he was not paid, and the employer claims that he paid him. The worker cannot swear and collect his wages. Rather, the employer can swear that he paid the worker, and he is exempt from paying. This is because we assume that even a busy employer makes sure to pay his worker before the deadline, so as not to be over the isser of paying late. Therefore, once the deadline is passed, the employer is believed and not the worker. But if there are witnesses who testify that the worker asked the owner for payment right before the deadline, and the employer pushed him off until later, that even after the deadline, the worker can swear that he was not paid and collect his wages. In this case, the worker is believed even after the deadline because the employer is clearly not concerned about missing the deadline. Someone hires a ger toshav. Ger toshav is a non-Jew who agrees not to worship idols. They hire someone as a night worker, and he is chayiv on the pasuk. You shall give him his wages on that day, and he must be paid before sunset. If he's hired as a day worker, he is not hired to the pasuk. You may not keep the wages of a worker with you overnight until morning. He does not have to be paid before the next morning. And Mishnah Yud Gimel, if someone lends money to his friend, the loan comes due, but the borrower does not repay it. The lender may not take an object from the borrower as security except through a court. The lender may not simply take an object from the borrower, but must have the court send an agent to collect it. The lawyer is the base of the lito mashkono. In addition, the agent of the court may not go into the borrower's house to take his property as security, but he must wait for the borrower to bring out the object. Where it says you may not come into his house to take a security, you must stand outside. The borrower had two utensils that the lender takes as security, and the borrower needs one during the day and the other at night. The lender takes one and leaves the other one with the borrower, depending on which one the borrower needs at the time. So, for example, if the lender takes the borrower's plow and pillow, or Metzia as a carbalayla, he returns the pillow every night and takes it back in the morning, and he returns the plow every day and takes it back at night. However, if the borrower died and his heirs inherit his possessions, the lender does not have to return the security to the borrower's heirs when they need it, because the obligation to return a security when the borrower needs it applies only to the borrower himself and not to his heirs. And Shimon ben Gamliel says, even when the lender must return the security to the borrower himself, he need return it only until 30 days have passed. From 30 days and on, he can sell the security in court and keep the money as payment for the loan. And that's the way it works. Amana ben she aniya ben she ashira ein mimashkanan so. When a widow borrows, whether she is rich or poor, we may not take a security from her. Shnamar v'lo sachbol beged amana. As the pasuk says, you may not take the clothing of a widow as security. Someone who takes a mill as a security transgresses an iser, and he's liable for two transgressions because the mill consists of two utensils, a bottom stone and a top stone. And it is stated he may not take the lower millstone or the upper millstone as security. Since the Torah mentions both stones explicitly, taking each one is considered a separate transgression. They're part of the same tool. It did not say that it is forbidden to take only a lower millstone or upper millstone. Anything that is used to prepare food may similarly not be taken as security. Because it is stated, the pasuk says he may not take the lower millstone or the upper millstone as security because he is taking a life as security. While with this statement, the Torah teaches that the reason one may not take a millstone as security is because it is something that the borrower used to sustain is the life by preparing food. Accordingly, it is equally forbidden to take anything that is used to prepare food. That's all for today. We'll continue tomorrow with the last perek of Metzia. Have a wonderful day, Colt.